Hello, everyone, and welcome to a video which I am very excited to share with you. It is a recording with someone who I just met, but who I think has very important things to say about the global circumstances that we're in and how we can engage more thoughtfully, more intentionally in a local sense. Um, we'll get into all of what's behind that, but before we get into it, I wanted to introduce you to Allison Wilens, who runs Altered Space Design, which has to do with sensory and kind of creating environments for folks with like sensory kind of processing things, which is something that is near and dear to me and to a number of my friends. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today, we're talking about something that was sparked by a Twitter thread. And I think, why don't we just start with who this is for, who we're trying to reach, and what you have in mind for them?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Um, so what we're going to talk about today is um, sort of how we can move from being from a consumer culture to becoming more like decomposer producers. And who this is for people who are action oriented, are wanting to do things to move us into a life affirming set of relations and patterns of behavior on this planet, um, that are maybe not sure, they don't have a roadmap or an idea of how that could even begin to be possible. So I'm hoping to uh, sort of plant a seed today that it is entirely possible. We can do it. We're going to do it. There are people doing it. It's going to be all right. It's going to be awesome. And we're going to get into how that could possibly be the case.
Awesome. And you said a really interesting phrase, which I'm learning more about since our last conversation, decomposer producers. And maybe that's a good place to start before we start like exploring the wider context of why this matters. What do you mean by decomposer? And then what do you mean by producer in this context?
Awesome. So most of us learn about the carbon cycle in school, and that's quite literally what I'm talking about. That's where, just brief overview, plants, the producers of the ecology, they photosynthesize, they produce nutritious resources from raw materials. The animals, the consumers, then eat the plants, they obtain the benefits of that production. Then the animals die, and decomposers, such as fungal networks, break down that accumulated consumption from that living organism into usable byproducts that get directed to where they can be utilized throughout the ecology. And what has happened in our human scale economies is that this decomposition step has broken down. Ironically, because that's what it's you're supposed to break things down, but we're not breaking things down. Instead, we're having this sort of toxic accumulation. And what we want to be doing is in right now our economic activity is producing this sort of accumulation and toxicity. And what we want is for our economic activity to actually be actively breaking down accumulated toxicity, and to even be reversing climate change. We want the product of the activities that make up our daily lives to be producing an environment that is going to work for us in the long term.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so in a weird and interesting way, like our society, our global society, and it has local ways of showing up too. We keep producing things in order to meet consuming demand, but there's never this like moment where things like collapse or they never decompose again. And there's like literal ways, I guess that's true, like with things like plastics, but also just in like the sense of what we're designing or building, what we're emplacing in the world, but not necessarily caring for over the long term. And so you're saying this is resulting in almost like an accumulated toxicity. Like the thought that comes to mind is like when we don't sleep enough, our brain kind of like builds up with like things that haven't been cared for, like you start to accumulate toxicity there, and you can't sleep and you get brain fog. Well, in a sort of sense, it kind of sounds like that's what you're describing, but in
Yeah.
this ecosystemic way. Okay.
I also
So
think the inner and the outer, it's like these are the same dynamics that play out on, you know, the scale of the human body versus the scale of a community versus the scale of the planet. And like, if it helps people to connect it to, I certainly do. I find it, you know, that brain fog and that sort of toxicity on the individual level is absolutely connected to our patterns of behavior on that larger scale, and it can help us understand it.
okay, so we have this happening on multiple scales, and this is the interesting part of it that we're kind of looking to understand better. So what I proposed to you before was maybe we could do something, run through a little framework that my mentor Jay Bloom taught me, called the ideal present, and it has a lot to do with understanding what mess we're in today, so that we can understand what mess we're about to end up in if we do nothing about it. Um, and then kind of use that as a jumping off point to start talking about what we want instead and how we could act today to maybe start tiptoeing towards those better futures. So if it's all right with you, um, I'd like to maybe start with that. And starting with the present mess, if I'm going to be honest, like some people don't like being all negative. And so depending on whether it's important to you to emphasize positive things about the present moment, we could dig into the positives of the present. But if I'm being honest, like the thing that really is interesting to me is the bad.
Yeah.
So your call here.
I'll spend like a very brief moment on the good,
Okay.
because I think it'll help us. But yeah, we know that's what we're here to talk about is the situation at large. But so yeah, the good, I would say we have lower threshold, higher accessibility of the means of production than we ever have before. Um, Monetary support exists to develop local design, manufacturing, distribution skills and capacity. People want to fund this if you're somebody who wants to learn um, a skill that fits into this sort of, again, design, manufacturing, distribution. There are people who want to pay you to build this. And then a third thing, and like as we both said, we're not going to get into any of these pieces in super big detail right now, so we can come back to them. I'm just sort of laying them out. A third thing that I think is good is that we have a higher networked capacity as a species than ever before. We have the access to knowledge and collaborators across the world, a readily available flow of information. It's possible to learn anything, and we're getting real-time feedback from like from the edge spaces of our systems, you know, like the amount of time it takes for the consequences of our actions to reach us is much shorter than it ever has been before. We actually have one could even say that the information infrastructure needed to be here in order for us to be able to be at this point in time, to be able to address this uh, great redistribution and reallocation of attention and resources. And I think, the great news is that we have what we need to do that.
Okay. I like this point, especially because one version of this, which is I think what we addressed at the beginning, is like we're not sinking into despair. We're starting from a place of, wow, okay, actually, where we are today is a position of possibility.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have what we need
Yeah.
to solve the problems.
Yep.
And I think that's actually a really important point. Um, okay. So those are some of the positives.
Great news, everyone. If we work really hard and give it all of our attention for like the rest of our lives, we're going to be fine. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So tell me about some of the less great news.
Okay.
What mess are we in right now?
Yeah. So to be frank, humans and primarily actually sort of Western exported industrial societies beginning in, primarily America and Europe, due to our avoidance of decay and the removal of that step from our economies, we accumulate resources that do not get passed into the ecology. Not only that, we because of colonization and patterns of displacement and rootlessness, are creating sort of disruptions in the embedded relationships within places, which constitute the bedrock of healthy soil, culture, and climate. Less abstractedly, we produce with our behavior a tremendous amount of heat, CO2, that does not get captured and utilized. It's instead released into our atmosphere. And a big reason for this is sort of both our frantic pace of never having enough and also a lack of reciprocity. We have stopped feeding the systems that sustain us. We don't give them what they need. And so they're not as able to take care of us as we need them to be. Much of the carbon on this planet is sequestered by old growth forests. We have this idea we can just plant new trees, and this isn't the case. This is the level of granularity I want to discuss, particularly looking at the old growth. There's other ways to sequester carbon, but the thing about the old growth that I want people to understand is that old growth, what it is a system of relationships amongst living organisms in a ecology, that in doing the activities that make up the substance of their lives, they have reached a level of complexity and relationship to each other that allow for the sophisticated metabolism of carbon and other resources that allow for this stable circulation that we rely on. And that plays a pivotal role in the stability we still have. It takes years to develop those relationships, and there are no shortcuts. And so, primarily the people who have been defending these old growths, and it should be all of us, but primarily it's been the indigenous peoples of the world, because they're also in relationship to these forests. They're part of that complexity, unlike people who have become uprooted from their place-based ways of knowing and being. The indigenous peoples of the world have been stewarding and tending to these ecosystems. They recognize smaller signs in the fluctuations of the health of those systems, and they're invested in protecting them because it's their community. Those relationships are active relationships. They're not abstract. And like European cultures have largely experienced a sort of mass forgetting of being cut off from our place-based relations, again, due to centuries of displacement and colonization of other places without being in relationship to what is already there, or that having that relationship be one of extraction and neglect at different turns. And what's really important, the perspective I'm bringing today, is that we also have a role as stewards of this earth. A history of rootlessness does not mean that's the only way we can move through the world. It's a huge problem that white people do not feel they belong to the earth. We are often made to feel we have to either dedicate huge portions of our lives to extractive projects or resource accumulation in isolation, or steal from other cultures what we lost in aligning with colonial projects we assimilated into or undertook. And that has caused all kinds of problems. We don't think of ourselves as producers of culture. We think we have to go somewhere else and consume it. This leads to displacement of local communities, increased accumulation of toxicity in our home regions because things aren't broken down and metabolized by us, and collapse on greater and greater scales. And we experience this on the human scale, through gentrification, when housing prices go up, when you leave the area that you're from, and the emotions and whatever that it brings up for you, and whatever you feel you weren't getting from that place, and you go to somebody else's neighborhood, and you don't think about the effect your actions have on that place. And we see how that leads to displacement and the collapse of the relationships within that place. Soil health is the same. It's the same. It's all relationships and the complexity of those relationships that allow for the development of life-affirming culture. And there's this two-pronged, there's the displacement of organisms and people and patterns of relating that are providing important functions in an ecology. And there's also, for the health of that ecology. And there's also the displacement of like where we leave. Like we don't see ourselves as an important part of the places that we're leaving, and we actually are. And when we leave, we take a certain degree of we sort of cut off those relationships that we have been holding and carrying, and that also has an impact. um, Even when we think about redistribution or providing for a kind of commons, a lot of us don't think of ourselves as having a direct relationship with production. We think we need to convince somebody else to realize our vision on our behalf, in all its complexity and abstracted from our community embedded relationships. And it's just a really unwieldy system for actualizing a vision. And people don't know where to start. They're so overwhelmed. And there are models. People return to ancestral ways as a roadmap, but in some ways we have to consider problems on a global scale that our ancestors did not have to consider, and we have to ground in the relationships of our current context. I think this is also really important, this idea of current context, that we can't just apply a perspective of what was historically a place was like. We have to look at what it is now. And when we talk about the future mess, I think I have some more thoughts that are best served there. I'll say one more thing, which is about this idea of viral versus fungal growth. Right now, we have global supply chains that are super energy intensive, and we have localized, specialized knowledge that isn't, and feedback that isn't brought into the rest of the system, or like into the awareness of most of the operators of that system. And what we want to move to is our local supply chains and globalized access to local wisdom, and not in an extractive way, but in a way that is supporting the development of local economies and the autonomy of local economies, sort of like support for self-determination within the context of a global information commons. And we can come back to that, and talk about the future mess.
Amazing. Excellent. Yeah, I think I'm really excited about this metaphor of viral versus fungal growth because once you understand it, as you explained it to me before, it makes a lot of things make sense. But let's come back to that, as you said, and let's talk about, we just described our present mess, and there is a lot in the mess. There's a lot
Yeah.
messing about at the moment, and one of the things that the person who helped me like sort of learn about this would say, this is Jade speaking in my brain, it's like, okay, this is a process. This is an unfolding. This is a thing that is producing consequences. And so the question is, can we appreciate fully the consequences that these present conditions are producing for us now and eventually in the future? And so kind of like the idea is to project out into that future and say, well, okay, if nothing changes, what mess are we going to end up in? So I'll pose that question to you. Where are we headed by default?
Okay. I would like to talk about that, and I'm going to get my computer charger because I didn't practice reciprocity with my computer and I didn't give it what it needed to take care of me. So I need to go do that. Otherwise, we're going to have a collapse moment.
Excellent.
One moment. Okay. So
Excellent.
future nightmare. What is going to happen is that, so we're in a cascading feedback loop in which the biggest product of our activities is waste. And this is happening right now. It's not happening in the future. It's a process that is underway. And the future mess is cascading ecosystem collapse. So just as like your favorite small town, or like so like we've all pretty much had the experience over the years of like your favorite restaurant closed, or like some kind of aspect of your community changed, your friend moved away. That kind of like the relationships are changing, and things that once supported you are brought you, or were like a load bearing element of the community, beyond just sort of like things change, people go, we exit our lives, just like on a mass scale, like things that were deeply important to like the functioning and continued longevity of the community, are no longer there. And so the community itself breaks down. The thing that was holding it together is no longer holding it together. And so that community disperses and scatters and unravels at a faster pace. That sort of thing that we experience in our phenomenon, we experience at the human scale in our lives, is happening at the ecosystem level, where, system bearing species of animals, plants, fungi are disappearing, and we're having this biodiversity loss, and the relationships are being disrupted and displaced. And so these communities, the things that are holding them together, the biological communities together, are unraveling, and the communities are falling apart. Um, it's a cozy crisis. We're not investing in coziness. It sounds funny, but actually, so insulation, home insulation in near New York, where I live, is the cause of 72% of our carbon emissions, because which is a huge number.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. Which is, accuse a better word, but like, it's to think that we're heating our homes, and it's not staying in our homes, it's escaping the atmosphere, and we're having to heat more because we're not doing things like passive, construction, where like, we build out of materials that retain heat, so we're actively having to do more work. And this goes back to the sort of brain metaphor, because when we don't have good insulation, we don't have good when our neurons aren't being adequately nourished and supported too, and we're constantly in these like high stress activation states, our body ends up working harder and consuming more resources and contributing more to a sort of cascade of chronic effects on our body system. And the same is true of our environments. And the same is also true of, like, the way that we garden in our agriculture, which is also a huge emitter. We bring in you know fertilizers from off-site. We burn fossil fuels to move them to location, instead of just producing from the waste products of that region the necessary components for feeding the food that we produce, so that it can feed us. And so, yeah, in many respects, we're not creating climate for ourselves and for the things that sustain us, that are healthy. And so that causes us to have to work way harder to get our needs met, which contributes to the crisis as well. And as things progress, it's going to be, I talk about coziness because I want people to have like a bodily, sensory, somatic understanding of what this means. It means we're going to be uncomfortable, right? It's not like the ecosystem collapses and it's like, oh, that's sad. I liked the trees. That's a bummer. It's like, no, the air we breathe, the temperature outside, the ease with which we exist in our environment, everything is going to go on hard mode. Everything that we do now is going to be on hard mode, and our infrastructure is going to be pushed to the limit and possibly break, like it's already breaking in many places in the world. The things that we rely on to sustain us, the systems as they currently are going to break down. We're not going to be able to get goods from overseas as easily. That's what we talked about with the supply chain crisis. What that means is, if you're getting baby food or asthma medication or whatever it is from an overseas supplier, or even an out of area supplier, and the distributors can't meet that capacity, then you're not going to have things on the shelves that you need to buy when you need to buy them. And the things that we're going to need, the threshold for existing comfortably is going to continue to go up. That that's literally quite, we look at it in terms of like costs of living and costs of rent and everything like that, but it's also just energy expenditure. So like, how much heat and air and like all the things that we do to be comfortable now, we have to expend more to maintain that level of comfort. And not just comfort, but good health, because the consequence of all of this is that it makes it much harder for us to survive and people are going to die. Um,
So we're in a situation now where the default future that you see is one of kind of almost incremental failure with probably a little bit of punctuation here and there of like, oh, it's really big. And then we lose something else. And that becomes permanently part of the things we have to overcome in order to maintain our status quo of like expectations.
yeah,
And so we'll work harder. And if I'm understanding what you're saying, that will actually increase the energy that we need to consume and the work we'll have to do. And there will be less and less capacity as time goes on. So are we going to just accelerate the problem if we stay on that path?
yeah, will accelerate the problem, and certain places will become uninhabitable, and that will accelerate displacement and the load that gets put on the infrastructure and the places that people end up moving to. Um, and I think that there's an important piece I want to talk about. I don't know if now is the right time, but I wanted to go back to this concept of embedded relationships, and also mention the work of somebody named Tao Ryan, because I brought up sort of this colonial framework, and this, when we're talking about ecosystems, you know, a corollary is this, the idea of invasive species, and the way that invasive species exist in an environment, and the work people do to sort of support native plants and restore native plant communities. And I wanted to talk about, again, because I am somebody who comes from refugee immigrants, and so I'm not living on the land that my ancestors were originally from. I live on Lenape land in New York, and but my family has been here for, I'm fourth generation. So we've been here for a long time, and my embedded relationships, are not in Europe. My embedded relationships are here in New York. And I think this is something that's really important as we sort of grapple more consciously with colonization, and with, the sort of historical, reciprocity that needs to happen. Things like land back, things like reparations for slavery and for countless other harms, and ways of making right, and sort of, feeding giving to people who have had resources extracted from them, and who built the systems we're currently in, whose labor contributed to the comfort that so many people enjoy. Like, I think all of that sort of is part of the larger pattern of, we have to give back to where things have been taken. But what I wanted to say was that within that, there's still a place for people like me who are to belong to the earth, that we belong to the earth, and that our role is not just as consumers, it's as stewards of the earth and of our own relationships where we are. And it's an interconnected web. And when I leave this area and no longer perform my activities that I do in this area, that has an effect. My absence has an effect. And this idea of, well, we can just go back to how things were, ignores the fact that the embedded relationships that we have exist in a form that is different than they did a few hundred years ago. And I want to talk about Tao Ryan's work because of the cascade. So what we have found is that sometimes when an environment changes, an invasive species will come into that environment. And sometimes it's the invasive species itself that is crowding out native plants and preventing them from growing. And so that is an example of when you want to like remove invasives so that the natives can come back. There are other times when the the environment has changed to such a degree that the native plants are hibernating, and there needs to be an ecosystem succession before those plants will actually be able to come back. So they're still there and they can come back, but in the meantime, the ecosystem is in such a state whereby when you remove the native plants, when you remove the invasive plants, the natives don't just come back. And what does happen when you remove the invasive plants is that that those invasive plants have begun to fill a niche that was left open by the absence of those native plants. And so when you remove that species, the other species that have come to rely on that niche no longer have that support. And so collapse actually gets accelerated. So you think, oh, I'll remove the invasive because the invasive is the problem. But there are times in which the invasive naturalizes and develops supportive, not extractive, not parasitic relationships with that ecology, and begins to provide a role that actually protects the other native species in that environment. So the other long-term relationships in that environment. And that comes down to actually being in relationship with those species and people and long-term residents, what have you. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that wherever we go, we have to be in relationship to people who have been there for a long, and patterns of organisms and movement through a space that have been there for a long time, and pay respect to that. And that needs to be the indigenous peoples of these areas. And also, after generations have gone by, it includes the relationships of people who have been here for many years since. And this is going to be a controversial and maybe political part of my contribution to this conversation. But what I just want people to understand is that that if we that the relationships that we have in our current place, in the places that we are from, you know, that it's not an abstract thing. It's not something that is from like a pristine time where we were from a place and those relationships were valid. The relationships, the embedded relationships that we have to work with are the ones that we have now from the places that we have grown up and have lived in and developed. And we kind of have to love the ones we're with. Yeah. So that's just one piece of that I wanted to talk about, because to me, you know, when we talk about revitalizing local economies, we can talk about where people want to do that. I think that's an important question, is where are you going to practice this, you know, and how do you move with honor wherever you are. And I think part of that is like, if you're not in relationship with the indigenous people of the place you're in, or, you know, long-term residents and what's coming, but you're not going to, how are you going to know how you're affecting them? You know, and they're not equal. So again, this is the political thing. I'm trying to be careful how I say this, because I'm not trying to say that like people who, like my family who have been here for a few generations, have equal, you know, relationship to this place that indigenous peoples of this place have. I don't believe that's the case, but I believe that we're performing a role here and have been for a long time, and that this is where I personally am best suited to continue that work of of decomposing the waste that has been produced here, and embed and building that local economy. And it's going to be different for different people. But I think if I were to hightail it off to Europe, which I kind of want to do and think about doing often, I would be new growth in that. I would not be an old growth forest in that place. I would be starting over. And I think we have to ask ourselves, you know, I think part of what we have to do is grapple with all of the embedded emotions in being in a place, and that includes, and it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be, we're not going to feel like that there is one good answer, and like this is where we're gonna, wherever we are, we're gonna have to grapple with the historical harms that have been committed. And I think that's part of the work of being a decomposer is, what harms have been committed in this place. And if your family's been in a place for a long time, and has been through, the injustices that have taken place in that area, like what was your family's role and what was my family's role in that? What were we, what did we allow to take place, or what were we witness to? And like, what are our current capacities to help contribute to the making right of these things? Um, I think so. It's not emotionally easy, but I don't think running away from it is the answer. I don't think that taking the resources that we've accumulated here and just kind of hightailing it off and trying to act and being like sorry about the colonization thing is the way to go. Um, yeah, and I guess I'd love feedback about this piece of it because I think it is an emotional piece for people. And because of that, and it is for me, and that's why I sort of took a much more circular way of describing it, I think, than I did the original piece of this. And I appreciate all of your patience with that. And yeah, that's that's just, I think, I brought it up here in the moment, in the section about future mess, because I wanted to talk about about collapse and about what happens when you leave because you don't think you belong to a place or it's not the right place for you. I come from a suburb in a New York City suburb, and almost everyone I know has left, and I left and came back because the town wasn't built in a way. The community here does not encourage its young people to stay, and because there is sort of this, the way that resources move through the space, um, or don't move, that is not affirming to the development of enriching community. And so when all of the young people leave, what happens is what has happened here, which is that this is a community that has a lot of wealth, but all of the stores, half of the stores on the busiest street in the town are empty. They're empty. People aren't building things here. The people who had built things here, they left because there was nothing else for them here. And so if people, meanwhile, the people who are from here are the people who are off gentrifying other places. They moved somewhere else that they thought was cooler and didn't remind them constantly of the unfinished work of decomposition, decomposing the toxic accumulation and building our own life affirming culture. And people left that to go to other places that were already established and upset the balance of those places and contributed to the collapse of those places. And so my invitation is that people who live in towns like mine or who grew up in towns like mine come back home. Don't flee to some pristine pre-colonization identity in Europe. Don't go to Brooklyn or wherever you're going to go. Now people are going to Philadelphia. Sorry, Philadelphia. Go back to your boring suburb and make something here that out of what is here, out of what is the summation of the relationships that your family built. That is one of my calls to action. And let the people who are from the places that you're moving to build those places. And it's complicated. I'm not saying, people have all kinds of reasons why they leave places. And I think that is an important piece to talk about, that before we even get into logistics and business and like all of that fun stuff, people have to deal with like their grief. People have to deal with like what things weren't like when you were growing up, whether the needs you didn't get met or the harms that you endured, or the passions and desires that you feel cannot be fulfilled or could not be fulfilled when you were younger. And that kind of can take a while, to be honest. And I think no time like the present to begin and to also process everything that has to come around uh, responsibility and what we feel are the people in our lives and the sources of our lives who have sustained us, to who we may owe a debt of reciprocity.
Mm.
And then we'll get to it. It won't be that long. I promise. Spend a few years, you know, really just staring into the heart of your like trauma and fear and grief and like suffering. And like, just like on the other end of that, you'll be like a superhero. And or I mean, you'll be a dude, you'll be an average person, you're not going to be, you're going to be normal, but like you'll be a person in an ecology with agency, and that's and the ability to build meaningful relationships, and that's pretty cool. And then we can begin with the next piece.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. People, I think often, it doesn't matter what context they're in, like we want the answer now. We want the easy thing now.
Yeah.
And with things that have any sort of major consequence, it takes years and years and years of constant, not like hard work necessarily, but constant attention and engagement. Like it's not necessarily backbreaking work to pay attention to certain things and appreciate embeddedness and to deal with grief and like it's hard, maybe in some ways, but like it's not it's not like so hard that you're going to be exhausted all the time. It's like it's literally just showing up and being part of it.
Right, exactly.
So you're a human being in an ecology with agency. Like actually, it comes back to this a little bit. Like, hey, we actually have what we need in some ways.
Exactly.
So you see this inevitability of collapse, and perhaps accelerating collapse, because the way that we'll cope at first will be it'll feed into these cycles of like just increasing energy consumption in order to deal with the inconvenience, like symptoms of a bigger, deeper problem. And so,
People will like go. I mean, people will literally go to the some mountain somewhere and try to build a digital eco village, instead of going home and talking to your grandma and hanging out with the townies in your hometown. Like, if you tell someone, you're like, you can save the world, but like you're gonna have to go and hang out in the suburbs. Like, it's like that's yeah. It's like it's funny, actually. It's pretty funny.
uh, Jabe, who's the guy that like taught me this whole like ideal present thing, like one of the things he complains about a lot is like the utopic, like escapist futures.
Yeah.
And so here's like a little bit of a spoiler alert for this whole framework thing. Like we could probably get away without spending very much time in the ideal future. Like we could probably just wholesale just like ignore it.
It's gonna
And
be emergent. We don't know. It's arrogant. What do you mean? Like we can't control this. Like, like it's all right. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And it's like the problem with the ideal version of things is that the instant one little part of your prediction goes wrong, that whole future gets cut off, and actually it doesn't play out that way anymore. Like you have a whole new like future that's being built. So what in the design of this canvas, like the in this kind of framing, like the thing that he wants us to pay attention to, especially if we do think about the way we really want things to be, then it needs to not be an escapist, like fantastical future. It needs to be something that is defined in terms of how things will be different from the way they are today and the way they are going to play out by default. Not just so like some other thing, specifically
Right.
how is it going to be different from this and different from this.
Yeah, and I think it's like that goes back to like what have we been doing versus what could we be doing, um, and yeah, we can get into that. Um, is now a good time?
Now's the perfect time. As good a time as
Great.
anytime.
Um, yeah. So, um, yeah, and I guess I will say, in my mind, one point about the ideal future which is, to me, I think what it would be is like, that we've voluntarily restructured our economy rather than having it just sort of thrust upon us in like the most crisis state possible. We have a healthy circulatory system built on localized, authentic relationships that are built around decomposition and production of a culture specific to our context. We're not we're with we're in we're there's a global information commons, but it doesn't try to abstract away and homogenize local culture. It seeks to learn from it and support its growth. Our economic activity um, actively lowers carbon emissions. Yeah, so our economic activity actively lowers carbon emissions. It reverses global warming while building connection and meaning in our lives. We feel like we belong to the earth. People who have sustained whole cultures because they had wealth extracted from them, resources will be returned to them. We practice solidarity, not charity, and we support one another's autonomy. We don't seek to collapse ourselves into one system that doesn't work for all people. And to me, how we get there, again, is we love the ones we're with. And we don't try to escape and be invasive species somewhere else, where we actively are suppressing the ability of existing communities to grow. We go back to the places that we ran away from in our current lifetimes, and we ground in the relationships that we have. Our family, our friends, our neighbors, the people we grew up around, or wherever you are. If you've been in a place for 20 years, you don't have to move back home. Wherever you feel your embedded relationships are, to the great is where you can build. And we can also be in connection with one another. You don't only have to be like, that's the idea of being a local node within an information, a global network, is that we are supporting and in relationship with people who aren't exactly right next to us. It's just that our production of culture is local and not relying on these global relationships that are unsustainable and extractive. So another thing we do, we build hometowns we don't want to run away from. We make space to confront the grief and other emotions that we have that are preventing us from returning to these relationships and giving them our attention. We cultivate our individual level direct relationship with our environment. So we learn to communicate directly with our ecology again, paying attention to it, understanding how it changes and expresses itself and what it needs. We practice gratitude for what we have, reciprocity, anti-colonial solidarity. Those of us who are, coming into environments where we have a lot of accumulated resources, our role is to decompose the toxicity we have allowed to build. We go slower. We don't move fast and break things. We go slow and carefully. We change course when we see early warning signs. We go at a pace that allows for human flourishing. We think about multiple generations, and and this is a lot of some of these ideas that I'm putting forward. They are ideas that are practiced by the indigenous peoples of our areas, and want to honor that. I didn't invent those ideas, and the intellectual contribution that I'm trying to add today is this decomposer role, and this idea that maybe actually we do eventually all go back to Europe. Maybe we do leave. Maybe there's who knows what our roles are in these places long term. But right now, it's like what's necessarily best for the world. It's like it's context dependent. We are where we are, and in this moment of transition, it's like we build beautiful places where we are. We metabolize where we are. And so how this goes back to supply chains is that, we're going to have to learn to create the products and activities and services that sustain us are going to have to be built upon the waste products that are in abundance in in our current areas and that are not being utilized. They're only waste because they're not being put back into the system in a way that allows them to be used. They're separated out. And so the call to action is to take stock of the garbage, is to really look at the stuff that we like to avoid. As we move through, go for a walk in your neighborhood, look at what people throw away, think about what you need, and how can you build the things you need out of the things that have been thrown away. What needs to be broken down, right? What is at a toxic concentration, and how, what needs to be, and then where is that resource needed elsewhere. That's what it really comes down to. And the same is true of people. It's like, our presence in one location might be toxic, but there's a place where we are needed. There's a place where we belong. And where is the place where when we go there and we put our full creativity in that place, it flourishes in a way that it, wasn't flourishing in our absence, because we had a role to play here. That's what I want people to consider, is where, what is being neglected, and how can we turn our attention to those neglected spaces in our lives, and take ownership of tending to those spaces.
Tending to is a word that means a lot to me, and I think it has a lot to do with just taking on the fact that you are an agent here. You are someone who is able to notice things and see things and care for things.
Right.
And one of the things that we've explored a little bit in things like wordly mapping and this other stuff that we've played with before is the idea that things that you can't understand or can't see, or can't like touch in a way, like it's really, really hard to care for things that you don't understand.
Yeah.
So I like this call to action to just kind of notice what's going on. Like we talk a lot in like the communities that I'm from about situational awareness and being aware of what's happening, like just literally being aware, because it implies certain kinds of decisions start to be possible when you are informed. But we're not aware even remotely. We're like almost consciously unaware, like or like we're deliberately ignorant in a weird way. So I
Yes,
noticed like
we're deliberately ignorant because there's the emotionality, and this comes out to, I'll just do one plug for my business, which is Altered Spaces Design, which is all about designing environments that are supportive environments, whether that's interior, landscape, or for events, design, set design, things like that. My It's about how do we work with the spaces that we're in to allow them to become supportive of our intentions. And a lot of that to me is like not imposing an idea, but instead like what is there, and like making space to look at what is there, that we are avoiding. A lot of times when like a mess gets out of control or a space is out of control, it's not organized, that it's because there are forces in a space that like are trying to get needs met, and like, so what needs are trying to be met by the current pattern of behavior in that space, and like how do we intentionally structure support for those things instead of pathologizing them. And like what is already in the same thing with like the landscape, it's like, I'm trying to get I'm trying to get rid of all the lawns in this suburb. That is my hope and my attention. I would feel good about, but also, obviously I'm in collaboration with the people that I work with. But like for instance, in the yard that I am currently removing the lawn from this yard, uh and replacing it with wild strawberry and red clover. I didn't plant the wild strawberry or the red clover. Those plant communities were already here. I noticed they were here and I supported them to do what they were going to do. I didn't even, and this is even kind of like more emergent and more, hands off than even permaculture, because or things like where like you're going to have your holistic design that you impose on a space. It's very like, it's still very controlling. Whereas to me, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to be here every day for like the next 5 years and like I'm going to see what the communities are up to and how I can help. And like a very like, that's the approach that I try to take in that work. And that I'm trying to get better and better at. And like that's how I approach it with, I think, at the level of our economy as well. You learn what people are trying to naturally do, and you support them to be able to do that. That was me with a watering can, supporting people, to like, you don't say you're going to grow that way. You say like, oh, you're growing that way. That seems cool. And you give that attention and you help that to come into being. And then when people are doing what they naturally are going to do and want to do, that's affirming to them, it's providing something that is sustaining the environment and sustaining us. And that's, an emergent offering that I'd love to talk to really anybody about at any moment. So
That's really an interesting like thread to pull too, because there's a thing we talk about in sort of my weird part of the internet about like conditions and consequences. Um, so strategy is like a thing that I'm in the middle of a lot of the time, and which is it's a very like funny concept because like the westernized version of it is very like imposing your will on the world, and
right.
you have your design and your chain links of causality, and like if I do this then that'll happen, and then like that'll happen, and that's just the way it's going to go. And then it's a matter of just like destroying the friction, the resistance to your plan.
Right.
That has it's in the words of some scholars, it's like, well, unintended consequences. Like meddling is kind of the way to view that version of things.
It's
And
just
the
arrogant. It gets a thing done, but it's like all that point, what we're looking at is friction. It's actually information. It's actually about a possibility. And I mean, I think about this matters a lot to me because I mean, I have ADHD, or I am ADHD, whatever you want to call that. And I feel personally that a lot, and this is like a whole other rabbit hole that we don't need to talk about in great detail now, but I personally believe that the that like procrastination isn't entirely, that a lot of the stories we tell about it are not helpful, and that actually we miss a lot of information about like this was actually maybe not the right time to do this activity, and that's why I don't want to do it. There's a better time to do it, or it should be done differently, or I have to go through like a consciousness metabolism exercise before I can really offer something of value in this process, whatever it is, or like I need a better chair before I can focus, whatever it is. It's like those points of friction are actually pointing the way to how the system is seeking to optimize. And if we just steamroll it, then we don't get to learn and benefit from that wisdom.
yeah, it has a disposition that is going to produce like almost going back to like the current mess, and the way that that is in a sense setting the conditions that are going to produce the futures that we're going to end up with. Like it's the same, it's a very similar kind of thing. Like there are conditions in play that are going to inevitably produce certain kinds of consequences. And we don't know when, we don't even necessarily know exactly what, but we know sort of kind of what's probable. And so tending to those conditions is a lot more interesting to me than trying to come in with a massive intervention to fix it all.
Right. And I think, so we started out with this by saying, like, hey, if you're overwhelmed and you're like looking for a roadmap, like, like that's what we're trying to talk about today. And yeah, I think bringing it back into like the scale of individual people's lives, I think all you have to do is show up. All you have to do is tend your relationships. If every person does this at the scale of every person on the planet, we're gonna repattern the economy. It's gonna work. You know, it's this feeling of we have to take back our ability to create for ourselves the things that we need. We have to take back our ability to feel rooted to place. We have to go at a speed that is we have to respect the relationships around us. Yeah, and not try to impose our will so much, which I think will be good for our blood pressure. Like it's like honestly, it's like, why are we, it's like even I think it's good news, right? Because we're all sitting here like, climate change, we gotta work, we gotta fix it. And it's like that franticness is literally what's causing it. It's like, actually, we have to calm down. We have to like slow way down and kind of like just hang out and make progress at like a really slow pace. And that's what's gonna, yeah, that's what's going to work.
So I really like this focus on just showing up, because what is amazing is that like transformations of any kind don't happen overnight, but they can happen over time as a result of the accumulation of small little baby steps.
Yeah,
And
it's so annoying. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
jump
Please
right
go.
in. No, go for it.
Oh, just that like we have this false binary between the commons and individual action, and so many
Yeah.
people want to be like, oh, this is a collective problem, and you can't just recycle and like solve it. And like, yeah, you're right, but like that doesn't mean that like I should be living a life where I'm entirely embedded within and dependent on systems that are destroying the earth. And like, I think I have a responsibility to use the privilege that I have to extricate myself from those extractive systems, to do so. And all of us who can do that, if we all do it, then it's not, we're doing it together. We're doing it, it's our individual agency, but we're doing it together. It's going to have a collective effect that is not insignificant. And yeah, we have to protect the old growth, and we have to stop these extractive behaviors on a grand scale, but that also comes down to culture. You know what I mean? And even in really basic ways, it's like, look, if you're doing extractive shit in the ecology, maybe you don't get to come to the cool party. Maybe like we're moving towards different ways, and maybe you do. Maybe we're not going to like shun you. Maybe I don't know how we're going to handle it. I don't know what the best way to handle it is. But like my whole point is that like these people who are doing like the corporations that are doing these things, it's not in a vacuum. Their support, and like even down to like it's I think this sort of like almost adolescent edginess to be like I'm the only one who understands, like all these other people, they don't care. And like it's like because we have felt unheard, and because we feel like our internal experience isn't reflected always around us, and like that's valid, and we have to give honor and like honor that. And also like sometimes the reason why somebody doesn't want to like if you actually ask somebody, hey, why don't you want to switch from like a gas stove to an electric stove, their answer is not going to be because I hate my grandchildren. You actually might find out that they have a real reason. And when you go in actually curious about the reasons why people do the things they do that you think are like harmful behaviors, sometimes you actually find out that it's really really important. There's an unmet need, there's a need that's being met there that has to get met some other way, and like we need to figure out that other way before that transition can be possible. And some other times you hear they talk, and then you realize, oh, the solution I thought made sense for this context didn't make sense at all. And that makes sense because that's not my context, right? I'm coming in from abstract on high thinking I know everything. And like actually the information feedback I'm getting back from this local embedded context is that that's not the right solution. There's another one. And if I want to support a transition in that context, I need to be deferring to and learning from the people who are in that context. And so,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's
Um,
that's right on.
well, and just so like on the grand scale of this idea of like, why aren't we, completely just like not using fossil fuels anymore? And it's because they're a part of every aspect of our lives, and there would be mass death if we did that. Like quite honestly, and that's what's hard. It's hard to confront because like we want to feel like we're like not part of the problem, that it is like just like 72 companies or whatever, like or like but like those it's like um you know the things that we order online and the product and the things that are embedded within this global supply chain, all of that is reliant on these structures that are unsustainable, and like we participate in them, and like we have reasons why we do that, and like our responsibility is to address those reasons and learn to get and to develop the culture that is going to be the replacement, so that we can turn it off and just kind of shrug it off. You know what I mean? Like, so that there doesn't have to be this like so it's like we're like, oh yeah, fossil fuels, we don't need to do that, we got a way better way to handle this. You know what I mean? Yeah, so it's not this like crisis choice between this thing that is harmful but like truly is sustaining us. It's like fossil fuels, it's like they're a demon, but like they're what we're relying on, and so we need to honor that too. And like that is like the shadow work, that is the like, what is this sustaining that is important to us, and how are we going to sustain it in a different way? And yeah, I think that culture change precedes policy change. I think that we want, our governments to take action to repair infrastructure and to, restrict the actions of these truly bad actors, but also that, you know, it's only when there is this robust culture that cannot be ignored that these sort of institutional structures tend to act in any sort of way. I find, you know, they respond to the shift in public opinion and behavior. They don't respond to like the fringe perspective. So it has to not be fringe. It has to be the cool thing to do. And we can like, like just like people compete for like, oh yeah, like my kid went to this university, like you can do the same thing with like, yeah, my lawn, I don't have a lawn anymore, I use all organic, like I have just like entirely restored the native ecology, or like, and you can't really, I mean, that is also a super fraught and political thing, is it's like, again, you can't have restoration without relationship to indigenous peoples, and it didn't, like what are you restoring, kind of like, if you don't have that mentality. But like, coming back to the tending, right? So like without that kind of qualifying of restoration, like we all have an ability to tend our environment, and to respond to it and to observe it and to like listen to the signals that it gives us. And we can be proud of that, and we could change the culture around that and what we reward with our attention. Who do we reward? Whose work do we uplift and consider to be work that is building the future we want to inhabit? And we can play off of all of the human impulses that sort of give rise to culture to facilitate that happening. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a really interesting model that I often go back to, which is by Edgar Schein, and it's like this idea of like, how do you change culture? Like, it's interesting that you brought up culture, and culture change is usually like it's a bucket that we hear, like it's a bucket of excuses for a lot of companies who are like, oh, the problem here is the culture, and like that's it. Like it's like the boogeyman. That's the thing that like we can't fix, and it's just that's the way it is. If you can change the culture, if only we could fix all these problems. And part of like what we're playing with is like, well, actually, culture change is kind of dependent on changing in values and attitudes. And it turns out that if people change their behavior, that like literally what they do, what they touch, how they do it, um, then the values and attitudes start to change with they shift with that behavior. And so there's like a cascade of sorts. And so you described a couple of interesting behaviors earlier. Um, just to kind of like very briefly describe some of these. The first thing that I heard you say earlier was just like showing up. Like, and this is going to be hard, I think, in some ways, for me, because I tend to be very abstract, and I think what we need is to be very concrete.
Yeah.
So I'm going to rely on your help for making these concrete. And it seems like two threads that are here is talking about taking stock and talking about being places.
Yeah.
What should I be writing down here if I wanted to give people just a new perspective on what they could literally do starting today?
Totally. Um, well, I want to make one response real quick to what you just said about these corporations and the way that they abuse language, because I think this is
Yeah.
important. Is like this comes back to again the idea of fungal versus viral. Is that viral is abstract. It grows really quickly, and bad actors, and even us, really all people. It's very easy to take a word and to kind of pull some of the meaning from that word, but not have it be not its full sort of embodied, embedded meaning, and dilute it of its revolutionary potential. And
Yeah.
I think we see that a lot. And then people defend the words. It becomes about arguing what the words initially meant, and it becomes this whole like thing instead of like actually. And that's why it's like things have to be embedded because you can't abstract away embedded value and embedded information. You have to, and that's why it has to be all of us kind of as individual nodes and as community nodes. And it has to be embodied because, and what that means is like the collection of relationships in my life and the way that I interact with them, which is different and not reproducible from the way that you interact in yours. And it literally means like, when I, do the dishes in my house, I am participating in that ecology and in relation to the people around me. And when I tell people in my neighborhood that I'm collecting socks so that I can make planter cozies out of the socks. And so then they know about that and they drop their socks off at my house. And I make stuff out of their socks. And uh, when I grow flowers and I give the flowers away, it's people who just had a baby and they like flowers. And I go to their baby shower and literally the stuff of our lives, um, in all of its like simplicity and profundity. Um, and what you can really do in your area is going to be so context dependent. It's what do you need? What are your unmet needs? What are the unmet needs of the people around you? Where are opportunities to provide support for people's existing expression? You know what I mean? Like we're not imposing our will, we're supporting what people are wanting to do. And so what is that? Getting to know people's desires, hopes, dreams, and fears and pain points, and like how and what, and then taking stock of what we have. What do we have to offer in the way of support for those goals? And then that might be in this redistributing function, this like gardening function, of like, I'm noticing this resource is here in abundance, often in the form of garbage, and I'm going to redistribute it. I'm going to say, I'm going to take this. There's a lot of wood pallets in my neighborhood. I notice. I go around and I see businesses constantly are throwing away. You go to the business, you say, "Hi, can I have this pallet that you're throwing away?" Because they're throwing it away, And in fact, sometimes they pay people to take it. And so if you actually might be helping them go to a coffee shop and say, "Hey, can I have your used coffee grounds so that I can grow mushrooms on them. um, or like, so I'm gonna make furniture out of these pallet boxes, and I'm gonna need some help to do that. So I'm gonna ask my, elderly neighbor who's a woodworker, woodworking genius, to if I can learn from them. Um, and it's like we're building and strengthening these authentic relationships as we're redistributing these resources and getting our needs met and taking care of the needs of the people around us. And when we do this for long enough, we realize that, like, the products of our previous behavior sustain the new behaviors that are, can are give us the stuff that we need to produce the new behaviors. Oh, actually, we're not reliant at all at a certain level of complexity on these extractive global systems that are destroying the earth. Well, isn't that convenient? Then I'm really not going to care too much, when that, like, that those systems can't continue to function. And I think, like, we do still have to care. It's like this, again, this I think is what fuels partially this, like, individual commons divide. Is it's like the attitude is not, oh, I'm gonna get mine, me and mine are gonna get ours, and then, like, you screw anybody who, like, can't escape the industrial civilization as it is. And, like, also, like, that we're gonna go to, like, a primitivism, or like a try to, like, recreate this, like, pristine utopia, as opposed to, like, no, we're like an assemblage, we're like an abomination, but, like, in a good way. We're like, no, it's just like there's sacredness here. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like, but it's not like, it's like, yeah, it's like garbage. It's like we're composting the, our waste into beauty. And that is a revolutionary act, and we help the people around us. So when your needs are met, then you look for other ways to support the people around you to get their needs met. And we just do that over and over again every day, trying to get everybody's needs met until all of our needs are met. And that is my offering to how we can turn away from our previous ways and towards a future that supports all of us.
So thinking about everything that we've discussed so far today, if I zoom way out and I reflect on the mess that we're in, the things are not going well,
No.
and they're leading us to collapse, which is horrifying, and it's going to be collapse that it's going to hurt, it's going to be uncomfortable, and the way that we're going to respond to it, if it's the way that we've responded to things like it before, is actually going to increase the pace of that collapse.
Yes.
And when we're looking at that situation and we're comparing, like, yeah, we have a lot of ways that things could be better in our mind. It sounds to me like what you're saying is actually not abstract at all. It's actually very concrete. It is show up where you are, who's around you, what do they need? Do that consistently. Do that every day. Over time, what starts to add into that equation is, well, what do we have? What's around us? What do you notice? How is it that needs are being met today? How is it that needs could be met with what we have? Is there anything that you would add to that to punctuate it, to make it clear, to call people to action?
Yeah, I would say, look to the neglected spaces, look to the spaces that have been over extracted, look to where resources have accumulated in toxicity. That the stories, like, look to what you're personally avoiding. That avoidance, what is important? It's information. What we're avoiding is a pointer to the work that we need to do.
That's an amazing place to stop here. So go look at those neglected spaces, over extracted spaces, accumulated toxicity, and anything we're avoiding. Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share this with us. I know I have a lot to think about. I'm sure everyone else who sees this will as well. And if anyone wants to join Allison in thinking about these kinds of things, um, I encourage you to go find Allison on Twitter at Allison Wilens. Also, if you're in need of the kinds of sensitivity to altered like spaces and needs that you have in relation to those spaces, I also encourage you to reach out. It's something that matters a lot to me, especially from my experience in the corporate world. It's amazing how like it's corporations have a lot to answer for in terms of what they do to the surrounding environment, but also to what they do to us while we're in them, which is a whole other thing. But I won't go down that rabbit hole. Allison, thank you
One
so
day we
much.
should. I would love to talk to you more with you more about that. And thank you, Ben, for helping us make sense of the mess.